There's a particular kind of town you can still find if you know where to look. Sitting a few miles off the modern highway, bypassed so completely that most people driving through the state have never once seen its main street. Half the buildings are still standing. A faded sign for a motel that closed decades ago. A gas station with pumps nobody's used since the Ford administration. And if you stop and actually walk that street, you can still make out exactly what used to be there. Because towns like this one didn't slowly fade out over a century. They got hit by something specific, on a specific date, and you can practically point to the moment it happened. That moment, for thousands of towns across this country, was 1956. The year Congress signed the Federal Aid Highway Act and set in motion the largest public works project in American history. But here's the part I find genuinely fascinating, and it's the reason we're starting this story in 1960 instead of 1956 itself. In 1960, most of that new highway system didn't exist yet. It was still being built, mile by mile, state by state. And the vast majority of small American towns were still exactly what they'd always been, sitting proudly on whatever two-lane federal highway had carried travelers, salesmen, and truckers directly through their main street for decades. They didn't know what was coming. Some of them had heard rumors. Almost none of them understood what those rumors actually meant for their own town's future. I want to spend today in that specific, narrow window, 1960. The last stretch of years when a huge number of American small towns were still fully, completely alive, still sitting directly on the road that brought the entire world past their front door, just a few years before that road stopped mattering at all. Let's understand exactly what these towns actually were in 1960, because the thing that made them thrive is the exact same thing the interstate was about to take away. And that irony sits at the center of this entire story. Before the interstate system, American long-distance travel ran on federal and state highways that passed directly through the middle of nearly every town along the route. Route 66 is the most famous example, but this was the pattern almost everywhere in the country. Route 40, Route 1, Route 20. Dozens of numbered highways that functioned as the literal main street of town after town after town, sometimes for hundreds of miles in a row. If you were driving from Chicago to Los Angeles in 1960, you weren't bypassing anything. You were driving straight through the center of every single town along that route, whether you wanted to stop or not. And that constant flow of passing traffic was, for an enormous number of small towns, the actual foundation of the local economy. Motels, called motor courts or tourist cabins in a lot of these towns, sat right on the highway specifically to catch travelers looking for a place to sleep. Diners and lunch counters served truckers and traveling salesmen breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day. A completely different customer base than the neighbors we talked about in our video on small-town main streets. Gas stations, sometimes 3 or 4 of them competing directly against each other in a town of only a couple thousand people, existed almost entirely because of through traffic, rather than local demand alone. Souvenir shops, roadside attractions, and hand-painted signs advertising the world's largest whatever a town could plausibly claim. All of it existed to catch the eye of someone driving through who might decide, on a whim, to stop. This wasn't a secondary part of these towns' economies. In a huge number of cases, particularly in the more sparsely populated stretches of the country, through-traffic commerce was the single largest source of income in town, larger even than farming in some places, because a farm family might spend money locally only a few times a month, while a highway brought a fresh set of paying travelers past your door every single hour of the day. If walking through this kind of overlooked American history, one decade and one decision at a time, is something you enjoy, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America now, because we do exactly this every single week. Let's talk about what a town like this actually felt like in 1960, because I think the sheer amount of activity is easy to underestimate from a distance. Picture a town of around 3,000 people sitting on a major federal highway, somewhere in the middle of the country. By 7 in the morning, the diner on Main Street already has truckers filling most of its counter seats. Men who've been driving through the night and are stopping for eggs, coffee, and a chance to stretch their legs before the next long stretch of road. The gas station attendant, and in 1960 there was almost always an attendant, not a self-service pump, has already filled a dozen tanks before most locals are even awake, checking oil, cleaning windshields, making small talk with strangers who'll be 3 states away by nightfall. By midday, the motor court on the edge of town has a few cars already parked out front. Families getting an early start on a long day's drive, deciding they've had enough for the moment, or a traveling salesman calling ahead to reserve a room for that night. The souvenir shop, if the town had any kind of notable local attraction, a cave, a rock formation, a claim to some minor historical event, does a steady trickle of business from people who saw a sign 20 miles back advertising exactly this stop. And by evening, the same diner that served truckers their breakfast is now serving a mix of locals having their regular dinner and travelers who've decided this town looks like a decent place to stop for the night. The whole rhythm of the town, unlike the purely local, self-contained rhythm we described in our video about small-town main streets in general, was tied directly to a highway that connected this specific spot to literally everywhere else in the country. Strangers weren't an occasional event. They were a constant, reliable, expected part of daily life, and the entire town's economy had organized itself around welcoming them. Now here's where the story turns. Because in 1956, 4 years before the moment we're focused on today, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, authorizing the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway across the country, funded overwhelmingly by the federal government rather than the states. Eisenhower's own reasoning, worth understanding because it explains why almost nobody initially connected this project to what would happen to small towns, was primarily about national defense and rapid troop movement, inspired partly by his own experience with Germany's Autobahn system and partly by a frustrating cross-country military convoy he'd participated in decades earlier that took an agonizingly long time to complete on the existing road network. The interstate system, as originally justified to Congress and the public, was about moving military equipment quickly in a national emergency and about connecting major cities efficiently. Almost nobody in the initial public conversation around this bill was talking about what it would do to the thousands of small towns sitting on the 2-lane highways the new interstates were designed to bypass entirely. And that word, bypass, is the single most important word in this entire story. The interstates weren't built through town centers the way the old highways had been. They were deliberately routed around towns, often several miles away, specifically to allow uninterrupted high-speed travel without the traffic lights, speed limits, and pedestrian crossings a main street necessarily required. This was, from a pure transportation engineering standpoint, obviously the right decision. It made cross-country travel dramatically faster and safer. But for the town being bypassed, it meant something that most residents in 1960 hadn't yet fully grasped. The traffic that had built their local economy for decades was about to have a much faster, much easier option that skipped their town entirely. And there was nothing about the new road that required or even encouraged anyone to still stop. By 1960, this transformation was only just beginning. And that's exactly why this year matters so much for the story we're telling today. Construction on the interstate system had started in earnest, but a huge percentage of the eventual 41,000 miles was still years away from completion. Estimates suggest that by 1960, something in the range of 10 to 12,000 miles of interstate had actually been built, meaning the vast majority of the eventual system and the vast majority of the small towns that would eventually be bypassed were still sitting exactly where they'd always been, on exactly the highway that had always brought them business. This created an almost eerie kind of calm before the storm in a huge number of American towns. Some town councils and business owners had heard that an interstate was coming somewhere nearby, planned for construction sometime in the coming years. A few forward-thinking business owners tried to plan for it, some successfully relocating their motel or gas station to sit directly at a planned future interchange, rather than on the old highway that was about to lose its purpose. But a huge number of towns, particularly smaller ones without the resources or information to plan years ahead for a federal construction project whose exact timeline and route were often still being finalized, simply kept doing what they'd always done, filling up diners and motor courts every single day, with no real sense of how close the ground was to shifting underneath them. We're getting into the heart of what makes this year specifically so poignant. And if this kind of detail is resonating with you, a like on this video genuinely helps it reach more people who'd appreciate this kind of honest look back. I want to make all of this concrete with something closer to a specific example, because statistics about highway miles and retail decline percentages only tell you so much on their own. Picture a town. We'll call it Root Junction, though towns exactly like it existed under 100 different real names across the country. In 1960, Root Junction sits at the crossing of two federal highways, which is precisely why it exists at all. A spot chosen decades earlier because that intersection guaranteed a certain amount of traffic, no matter what else happened in the surrounding countryside. The Hendricks family runs the motor court on the north edge of town. 12 small cabins built by the grandfather back in the 30s, now run by his son and daughter-in-law, who took over, expecting to hand it down to their own children someday. Right across the road, the Blue Star Diner has been serving truckers and travelers since 1947, run by a couple who know most of their regular long-haul customers by their first name and their usual order, the same way the corner grocer in our earlier video knew his neighbors, just with a customer base that changes every single day instead of staying the same for decades. In 1960, business at both places is steady, unremarkable, exactly what it's always been. Nobody in either family has any specific reason to think about the highway planning conversations happening in the state capitol, because those conversations, at this point, are still mostly abstract. A line on a proposed map that hasn't been finalized, funding that hasn't been fully approved, a timeline that keeps sliding further into the future every time anyone asks about it locally. The Hendricks family is planning a small addition to the motor court for the following summer. The diner just repainted its sign. 4 years later, the new interstate opens 11 miles east of Root Junction, close enough that a sign on the old highway now points travelers toward the faster road instead of through town, and far enough that almost none of the through traffic that used to fill both businesses ever sees Root Junction at all anymore. This is not a real town with real names, but the pattern it describes played out, with only the specific details changed, across an enormous number of real intersections just like it, all through the 1960s and into the 1970s. As roughly 41,000 miles of new interstate gradually redrew the map of which towns America's travelers actually passed through. Let's talk about what actually happened once an interstate bypass was completed near one of these towns, because the speed and totality of the collapse in a lot of cases genuinely surprised the economists and planners studying it at the time. Research conducted in the years following interstate construction found that towns bypassed by the new system frequently saw double-digit percentage declines in local retail sales within just a few years of the bypass opening, in some documented cases losing more than half of highway-dependent business almost immediately. A motel that had been full every single night suddenly had a handful of guests a week, travelers who either hadn't found the interstate yet or specifically preferred the old road for reasons of their own. A diner that had served 3 shifts of hungry travelers a day found its busiest hours simply gone, replaced by whatever local customers happened to already live in town, a customer base that had never needed to support the diner's full capacity in the first place. This is the part of the story that connects directly to what we discussed in our video about the disappearance of small-town main streets generally. The interstate bypass wasn't the only force hollowing out small-town America in these decades. Farm consolidation and chain retail were doing their own separate damage at the exact same time, as we discussed in that earlier video. But for towns specifically built around highway traffic, the bypass was often the single most sudden, most devastating blow. Arriving not as a decades-long gradual decline, but as something close to an economic cliff, sometimes measurable within a single construction season. I want to be honest about something here, because I don't think this channel does anyone any favors by treating the interstate system as simply a villain in this story. The Interstate Highway System is, by almost any measure, one of the genuine triumphs of American infrastructure. Traffic fatalities per mile driven dropped substantially on interstate highways compared to the two-lane roads they replaced, engineered specifically to eliminate the head-on collisions, sharp curves, and at-grade intersections that had made the old highway system considerably more dangerous. Cross-country shipping times for the trucking industry improved dramatically, lowering costs for goods across the entire economy in ways that benefited nearly every American, including the residents of the very towns being bypassed. And for millions of ordinary travelers, the interstate simply made long-distance travel faster, safer, and considerably less exhausting than the old two-lane highways had ever been. Nobody signing that 1956 bill, and very few of the drivers happily enjoying a faster, safer trip in the years afterward, was acting with any malice toward the small towns that would end up losing their highway-dependent economy. This was, like so many of the stories we tell on this channel, a case of a genuinely good decision for the country as a whole, creating a genuinely painful, largely unintended consequence for a specific group of communities that happened to be standing in exactly the wrong place when progress arrived. So what happened to towns like this afterward? Because the story doesn't simply end at economic collapse. And I think what came next says something important about American resilience, even in the face of a change nobody in town had actually chosen. Some towns adapted, successfully rebuilding their local economy around whatever local industry, agriculture, or manufacturing existed independent of the highway traffic they'd lost, effectively transitioning back to something closer to the self-contained small-town model we discussed in our previous video, just with less of the retail abundance that easy highway money had once supported. A smaller number of towns found a second act as a specific kind of destination in their own right, leaning hard into nostalgia and Americana appeal along stretches like the old Route 66. Drawing a smaller but genuinely dedicated stream of travelers specifically seeking out the old road rather than the new one. But a significant number of towns, particularly the smallest ones, with the least alternative economic base to fall back on, simply never fully recovered. Population figures for a documented set of bypassed small towns show measurable, sustained decline over the following decades. Young people leaving for the same reasons discussed in our earlier video, but with an added specific push: the jobs that highway commerce had once provided, at the motel, the diner, the gas station, simply weren't there to keep them or their parents employed locally anymore. Here's the thought I keep coming back to about this particular chapter in the story. Unlike the slow, decades-long decline of the general small-town Main Street we discussed before, driven by dozens of gradual forces arriving at slightly different times, the interstate bypass was, for a lot of towns, sudden. You can point to a specific ribbon-cutting ceremony, a specific date the new road opened to traffic, and trace a direct line from that single afternoon to a motel closing 18 months later, and a diner laying off its evening shift the following year. I find something almost unsettling in that specificity, because it means an entire town's economic future, built up over generations, could genuinely hinge on a decision made in a state highway planning office about exactly where to route a new road. A decision that had nothing to do with that town's character, effort, or worth, and everything to do with the most efficient engineering path between two larger cities. Towns didn't lose their highway traffic because they did anything wrong. They lost it because a line on a map got drawn a few miles away from where their Main Street happened to sit. I don't think there's a tidy lesson to wrap this up with, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims there is. The interstate system made the country genuinely faster, safer, and more connected. And almost nobody today, including most residents of towns that got bypassed, would seriously argue we should have built a slower, more dangerous highway system just to protect a diner's breakfast rush. But it's worth understanding, specifically, what stood in those towns in 1960, fully alive, fully busy, with absolutely no idea that the road bringing them all that business was, in a very real sense, already being replaced a few miles away, while they went about an entirely ordinary day. That's the year I wanted to spend today in. Not the collapse, not the empty motor courts and boarded-up diners that came after. Just 1960 itself. The last stretch of ordinary, busy, unremarkable days before the ground shifted. Back when nobody in town had any reason yet to suspect that anything was about to change at all. If you've ever driven through a town like this, one that clearly used to sit on a busy highway and now sits quietly off to the side of a modern interstate, or if your own family has a story about a business that depended on highway traffic before a bypass came through, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. These are exactly the kinds of details that rarely make it into any official history, and every story shared here adds something real to a piece of this country's history worth remembering accurately. If this kind of honest look at how American life actually changed is something you'd like more of, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America. There's a lot more of this country's everyday history still waiting to be walked through. One town, one road, one decision at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.